mental ill health was something that you'd experienced prior to your wife sadly passing, wasn't it? It was something that you'd actually had experienced in the months leading up to her death.
Yeah, I had two bouts of mental illness. The first had been about 4 years before that, when we went through a very painful experience of wanting to have a brother or sister for Ethan. And we found out that Gemma had some very serious fertility issues. We went through IVF a couple of times. Doesn't work the first time, worked the second time, and then she miscarried. And men and women tend to deal with life events like this quite differently. And I was very much someone who just sort of retreated from the world for a bit. I got very angry and bitter and ended up sort of heading into this dark place that I stayed in for too long. And that was really my first bout of depression. It lasted a few months, took me to some really dark places. I was able to work throughout that period. Work was kind of my release, which for anybody who spends their life in front of a camera or a microphone, that might sound a little bit odd that would be your release, but it actually was. And through counselling and medication, I got myself back on an even keel. And that was it for quite a few years. And then inexplicably in the autumn of 2017, or at least inexplicably at the time, now I feel I've got much more of a grasp on why what happened did happen. Just this anxiety began to creep into daily life whenever work was coming up, whatever the program, whether it was the debate, which was a fairly straightforward show on Sky in the evenings once a week to debate the main football talking points of the day, or a Premier League game on a Saturday or a midweek. This huge anxiety began to develop that then became something that led to panic attacks. Into that came depression again. And although once I went on air, there was that release, this horrible build-up would accompany every time I worked. And as I've written about and spoken about before, the last time I tried to work for Sky Sports was at a game at Old Trafford between United and Tottenham, and had a full-blown panic attack about 20 minutes before going on air. And in the end, Sky, through conversations between myself and them, decided to take me out of the kind of front line for a bit and get myself right. But then into that period comes Gemma falling very ill and then dying. So you're talking about a period where everything you can possibly feel mentally comes crashing in all at one time. It was that period over 3 years ago. It was a colleague who called me out. I mean, Gemma knew what was going on, and obviously it's very disconcerting for anyone when we see the people we love struggling mentally. But it was my producer actually on Sky, and it was a game at Chelsea a couple of weeks before the incident at Old Trafford. And yes, it's a hard place to be, the world of football. It's quite macho, and we'd always have breakfast on the food bus before a game, and that was the sort of banter window, if you want to call it that, before we got down to the serious business of going through the programme and rehearsing and then getting on air at 11:30. And he'd noticed that I just wasn't myself. And I wanted to say something, I just didn't know how. As we were walking back from the food bus to the outside broadcast truck to start the production meeting, he just took me to one side. His name is Billy. And he just said, "Simon, you're not yourself at the moment. It's not the usual you. Is there anything wrong?" And you know, when those words came out of his mouth, I felt immediately this sense of a weight coming off my shoulders, because it felt like I was given, not that you should have permission, but it felt like I was being given permission to talk about what I was feeling. And I said, "Look, I don't know what's going on. I just feel incredibly anxious at the moment. I'm really worried about work. I have these panic attacks." And he just simply said to me, "Look, we can't do anything right now. I can't draft in a presenter with an hour and a half to go before we're on air, but I'll be in your ear, as in your earpiece, as much as I can today to help you through. If you're struggling, I'll have questions for your guests. And look, we'll just make it as easy as we can for you." That was an incredible response, because it was one of understanding. It wasn't someone going, "Oh, for goodness sake, come on, what's going on here?" And actually, when a few weeks later, I eventually had to step away from work, you know, my boss at Sky, Gary, was everything I didn't expect them to be. I thought it was going to be, the macho response, get yourself better, see you in a week's time. It wasn't. It says, "Right, how can we help you?" They wanted to understand what I was going through, what I was experiencing. And that again felt like this huge weight coming off my shoulders. Right, at last I can talk about it. Because for years, like so many blokes, I wasn't very good at talking about stuff. But something I've often said in the last 3 years when talking about this area is that, particularly for guys, but it goes for women as well, but particularly given blokes are particularly not good at opening up, vulnerability cannot anymore be seen as a dirty word. It's seen as a sign of weakness. If you're prepared to open yourself up and say, "Today, I'm just not in a good place. I'm struggling with this. I'm struggling with anxiety. I've got panic," whatever it might be, vulnerability for me is actually it's actually an expression of strength.
Simon, I'm really interested to talk to you about the sort of aftermath of Gemma's passing, and how do you balance the need to look after a young son who's got their own, kind of issues with grief, and the need to look after yourself and everything that you're going through? Can you talk us through sort of how you got through those early first few months?
I'm not sure how I got through it, that is the honest answer, but I did. I think a lot of it was down to the incredible love and support we had from friends and family. That was a really big factor. And I'm very aware as I talk about this that there'll be people perhaps listening who went through something similar, or in this recent period have lost a loved one and just haven't had that support, whether it's because they haven't got that support network anyway, or the period we're living in has made that particularly hard. But I was very lucky to be surrounded by some pretty amazing friends and family who were there for me long after the events of 2017. But it's a really difficult one because, on the one hand, you're trying to protect and nurture and love your 8-year-old boy through hopefully the hardest thing he'll ever have to go through, whilst also you're going through a crap storm yourself, and balancing those two things, being a dad. But also, because I'd always say to people, for me, the most important thing when you go through bereavement is to express your grief. Do not bottle it up. I've heard from way too many people in the months after we went through it, from people who didn't let their grief out for a long time. And you see when they tell their life stories, the impact, particularly mentally, that's had on them. It has to come out at some point. So it's balancing what would I show in terms of emotion in front of Ethan and what wouldn't I? I think the only thing I wasn't prepared to show in front of him, I sometimes did get it wrong, was anger. There was a huge amount of anger, the kind of injustice of what had happened. A lot of the anger actually on his behalf, the fact that now he was going to grow up without his mum alongside him for the rest of his life. A lot of anger, and I would tend to take myself away to the end of the garden, just well out of his way, and express that anger. But I think that was important for that to come out, because if it doesn't, it bottles up. It's like a fizzy drink. Eventually it'll explode and the top comes off and it's a mess. But in terms of emotion, in terms of breaking down, in terms of talking through some of my worries and some of my fears, I didn't tell him all of them. But it was important for me to have a conversation with him. But ultimately, David, the most important thing was let the horrible thing out. I think the first thing I would say is don't be too proud to reach out. There will be that sense in which, well, everybody's going through a tough time at the moment. They've got too much on their plate. They've got kids homeschooling, they've got a parent who's ill, or whatever it might be. Don't be too proud to reach out. Don't be too proud to pick up that phone and just say, I need to chat to someone. It is so important to keep talking to people. Don't just suffer in silence and believe that everybody's got too much on their plates. I'd say if you're supporting someone going through this, be careful what you promise. I remember a number of messages at the time this all happened saying, we'll always be here for you. And then 2 years on from that moment, you think, I never heard from you again. If you're offering to be there for a friend, okay, you may not be able to be physically there, be there for them. And actually don't take it as a sign they don't want to talk when that text message goes through and there's no reply. It gets the blue ticks on WhatsApp, but it's not replied to, or the voicemail never gets returned. Because actually at that moment, maybe they just don't want to speak to someone. But don't let that stop you reaching out to them, because I can guarantee you there'll be times where they will crave someone just to pick up the phone and ring them. And I'd also say it's important during this time to keep yourself going physically. That was one of the hardest challenges I found, is looking after yourself physically during something so impossibly hard. And if that's just dragging yourself out and going for a 10-minute walk, do something, because it's all too easy just to stay inside, particularly the time we're living in, and just take yourself to dark places. And I'd also say, and this comes from my own experience of doing this for a while, and it was never helpful. Sometimes we just want to numb the pain. We want to numb the reality of what we're living in. And all too often, alcohol can be the way in which you do that. And my experience was it would numb it for a while, particularly the loneliness. Loneliness is hard anyway, but when you're going through bereavement, it's the hardest thing to deal with. That feeling that you're on your own is don't plow into the drink, because what I found is it would numb for a while and takes you to a really dark place. I think, David, just to finish off, what I think there should be in this period is actually a greater understanding from all of us of what grief is, because actually what all of us have experienced over the last 10 or 11 months. This is an aspect of grief, what we've gone through, what we've lost, and it's not anything like as painful as grief, is we've lost the way of doing things. We've lost our normal lives. And into that has come lots of the questions and worries and insecurities that accompany grief. Like, what is life going to look like? Can I work anymore? How am I going to bring my kids up to be on a sure foundation when they haven't been at school for most of the last year? All of these anxieties and worries are what the bereaved will feel very acutely in the first few weeks and months. We've all had a taste of that over the last year, because we've all faced those questions. What on earth does life look like? There's been a lot of fear and anxiety being played out in everybody's lives. So we should have, I would hope, a greater understanding, or just a little understanding, of what it's like to go through grief, because actually we've all had a taste of
Yeah.
it.